I'm Margaret with Civic Nebraska's Voting Rights Team, and today on the Long March Forward for Voting Rights, we take a look at Asian American voting rights. To understand the full history of voter suppression, we need to look back at the history of immigration laws in the U.S. Upon ratification of the U.S. Constitution, the first act the newly founded Congress undertook was to pass the Naturalization Act of 1790. It established rules for naturalization. It restricted citizenship only to free white persons of good moral character. Property ownership was also a requirement, and it excluded women. Despite the Naturalization Act, by 1851, 20,000 Chinese had come to California seeking the opportunities the gold rush and construction of the Central Pacific Railroad afforded. This meant by 1880, 25% of California's workers were Chinese. Racial hostility and anti-immigration agitation by whites resulted in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. The original act was set for only 10 years. It was renewed in 1892 and added a further requirement that Americans of Chinese descent be required to carry documentation proving their citizenship. Largely due to a Japanese government propaganda campaign that highlighted the U.S. racist immigration policy, Congress passed the Magnuson Act in 1943, under which the only Asian nation allowed to emigrate to America was China. Yet only 105 Chinese people were allowed to enter the U.S. each year. In 1945, nearly 6,000 immigrants arrived in the U.S. from Europe. The next significant legislation on immigration was drafted amid the paranoia of the Cold War. The Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1952 contained provisions for a preference system that determined which ethnic groups were considered desirable immigrants and placed importance on labor qualifications. It is significant for Asian Americans that established their voting rights for the first time. But it wasn't until 1968 that quota limits were lifted for all Asian nations with the Immigration and Naturalization Act. My guest today is Caleb Rohrer. Caleb is a Frank Lemire Grassroots Fellow at the Nebraska Democratic Party and was recently appointed to the Planned Parenthood Advocates of Nebraska Board of Directors. Caleb is a half Taiwanese American born in Ohio and spent his first 3 years in Hunan City in Taiwan, where his brother was born. His parents worked at Yishan Theological College and Seminary for Indigenous students. His father was an educational missionary of the United Church of Christ, serving as a professor for the Presbyterian Church in Taiwan, teaching history of Christianity, and his mother taught biblical studies. After the end of the mission, his family moved to Iowa and taught at a private Christian college in Orange City, where he lived until moving to Kearney to attend UNK, studying music performance and political science. Thanks for joining me today, Caleb. Can you tell us what voting means to you?
First off, thank you for inviting me here to talk about this. Voting rights are very important to me for the Asian American community. Partially because of how recent Asians have gotten the right to vote, not just in America, but in the entire world. Sri Lanka was actually the first country in Asia to grant universal suffrage, and that was only in 1931. So we're less than 100 years removed from Asians as a large group overall really getting the right to a constitutional republic and democracy the way that we recognize it today. Even when we had the Magnuson Act in 1943, it wasn't until a few years later with the McCary-Walter Act that the rest of Asian Americans really got more of a chance to participate in our civic democracy here in America. So with democracy being such a recent development in Asia, it's really new to our community at large to be participating in civics. We haven't really had that in this long thousands-year history of our people. So getting the AAPI community to come out and vote has been historically quite difficult. And it wasn't actually until this year that we finally breached 50% turnout for the vote. We turned out at a rate of 59% this year, up from 49% in 2016, and it was even lower than that in years past. So we are really now just coming into our own as a voting community and as a bloc and realizing that it is important for us to show up and vote, even though it is not historically what we have done.
So how do you see this lack of civic participation by Asian Americans play out in your local community of Kearney?
In Kearney, what we actually see is, while nationwide we have this idea that the Asian American community has very high levels of education, we have very high levels of prosperity and wealth and low unemployment. That's actually not the case in Kearney and a lot of other communities, especially in the Midwest of America, where many of our population came not from voluntary migration or from selective immigration for their skills, but actually through relocation programs for refugees from Asia that might have gotten caught up in the civil war in Vietnam or Cambodia or China. And so a lot of them are here now and experience surprisingly high rates of unemployment. And when you don't have the ability to participate in civics, your voter turnout suffers from that. And that turnout suffers because of economic disparities, that people have to work rather than going to the polls. It's more important to make sure that at the end of the month, you have the lights on your house, food on the table, than it is for you to take the day off and go and cast your ballot. And breaking through that, especially in the Midwest, is very difficult because we're still reaching for the American dream. We haven't quite reached it yet. And that is an important goal that has to be addressed through civic participation, because to be American is to participate in civics. That is a fundamental right of what it means to be an American, and we're just now coming into that. So that is an ongoing challenge in our community, but we're making progress.
Can you tell us, Caleb, what legacy the Chinese Exclusion Act has had on the civic engagement of Asian Americans and why that should be a call to action?
With the Chinese Exclusion Act, even after the Magnuson and Carey Walter Act, we didn't quite have really in practice full suffrage, because what had essentially happened was that we had the right to vote if we were citizens, but it wasn't until the Immigration Act of 1965 that followed the landmark civil rights movement that we really actually had the opportunity to vote, because then we could be citizens. Before that, we weren't really considered Americans. People thought of us as foreigners. A lot of people still think of us as foreigners when they see us, especially because we do have such insular communities in the East and West Coasts. But what they have to remember is we have been here now for hundreds of years, or at least over 100, and we are Americans. Many of us are born here. We are not first generation, we're second, third, fourth generation immigrants. We are as American as anybody else. We have families that are scattered all over the country. We live in all 50 states. It's not just the Chinatown in New York or San Francisco. It's everywhere. Kearney's the largest town I've ever lived in, and it's 31,000 people. So the Chinese Exclusion Act did really have a long-lasting impact, because it limited our immigration for so long that it tied our civic participation to that immigration, rather than legislation saying that once we were here we had the right to vote. So it replaced voting laws with immigration laws for our community.
Well, thanks for joining me today, Caleb.
Absolutely, thanks for having me.
Those of you watching can make a difference too. To become a voting rights advocate, use the QR code on the screen or visit civicnebraska.org. You too can join the long march forward for voting rights.